Hey all, welcome to the Home We Build, where we aspire to be a movement of men who build their lives on a firm foundation. This week on the podcast, we talk about relationships. We have the Anvil Dispatch and a new segment called Fan Cave Movies. Let's get going. The Home We Build. So, over the last month or two here, we've been diving into intentionality. We've only got a week or two left on these topics. And this week, we're going to talk about relationships. But as always, we're going to reiterate our working definition of intentionality, which is to say proactivity, getting ahead of things before they become an issue, along with prioritization, which is to say focusing on the things that are the most important. And so the reason I want to talk about relationships is relationships are what drive life forward in a lot of ways between work relationships, relationships with your significant other, kids, family, friends, siblings, all of these different things and relationships work together to build what we call life, really. And so being intentional about the relationships that we have, the relationships that we want, and the relationships that we need to, or well, I should say, and how we manage those relationships becomes very important because we only have so much time in any given day or week or month, and to put a lot of time into a relationship that um, isn't life bringing and isn't um, giving you any, not necessarily giving you anything, but isn't building each other up in the way God would have us, those relationships become far less important than some of the relationships that do. And so I wanted to talk about relationships here. And so this is where boundaries are going to be, and being intentional about boundaries becomes very important. And because there are, like I said, there are some relationships that you need to nurture and spend a lot more time on. There's some that as you become a Christian and grow more in life, there are some relationships that end up having to get pared away and they don't aren't people that you spend as much time with. All of that to say relationships are difficult. Um, some are easier than others, but they can be very difficult. And two, we need to be intentional about trying to understand who the people are that we're engaging with. And through that, we can be intentional about how much time we devote to them and what kind of relationship we want to be having with them entirely. And I've heard a couple different, I wouldn't say frameworks, but I've got a kind of a little bit of a framework that I'm going to work with here today. And that is there are two different situations here. You've got Christians and non-Christians, and then you also have why, and then we're going to divide Christians into wise and foolish. So I know these categories are a little vague, but I want to bring a little bit of clarity to what I mean by them and talk about how we want to interact with each category and why we interact with them the way we do. So let's start with wise Christians. These are people generally speaking who, and it's not going to be all of these people, but generally they're going to be older than you and a lot of time, and they'll definitely have had a faith longer than you. And these are going there are some characteristics that you can look for, such as they've had a very long and happy marriage. That's not everyone, and some don't ever get married, but they're generally, as our pastor tells us, it's people who, when you're in church, they've been they're clearly on the older side, and they walk into church holding hands, and they've been doing and clearly been doing it for a long time. He's got his arm around her, and they've been married and walking in faith, walking faithfully with God. And so these kind of people you can never have enough of in your life. And I would strongly encourage you to spend as much time as you can with these people, because they're going to be able to give you advice, and godly advice, and advice that can help move you forward in life and help you avoid the pitfalls that you come through in life. And so wise Christians are just that. They've been around the block, and they've been doing it a long time, and they understand how to take biblical truth and apply it to life. Foolish Christians, on the other hand, and when I say foolish, I don't mean it from the standpoint that you're an idiot or something like that. I just mean it from the standpoint that they may be, and there's nothing wrong with this, but they may be a little new to their faith, and they're a little naive about certain things. And these people are ones that, again, you can have you want to have a lot of them in your life, because you have to walk through life with people, and you have to walk through um, trials and joys and tribulations and challenges, and all the gamut of feelings that everyone has. And you have to be able to walk through that with people, and there are only so many of the quote unquote wise Christians that you can get around you. Um, and so having people who are you're doing life with, and are in a similar position to you, where you're learning and you're all learning together, those are important people to have too. And these are people that you want to be encouraging, and you're getting encouragement from, and they're sounding boards, and they're people that you can work through challenges with, and you're doing life together with. And so these people, not necessarily going to be people that you're seeking a ton of guidance from. You can still seek some, and then you'll use them as a sounding board and whatnot. But when it comes to learning more about your faith, you're probably searching out more of those people who are a little bit further in life, ahead of you in life. A lot of these are a lot of times going to be coworkers, friends, um, sometimes siblings. And we want to build. These are people we want to build strong relationships with. Then you have, and I'm actually going to change this up just a little bit. Um, I'm actually going to add a fourth category here that I hadn't thought about. Um, you have non Christians, and some of these are, and these are going to be people who, um, you're not going to want. You don't necessarily want to spend a ton of time with them. Not that there's not that they're intentionally trying to lead you astray, but just being I've had a few of these people in my life, but just being around them can be problematic. I had a buddy in college who I didn't think it was happening at the time, but was very, very clearly an atheist. And I spent a lot of time with him, and I, at that point, ended up more or less walking away from my faith. I've kind of talked about that episode a little bit in my um, episode that was kind of my testimony. And we want to have people in our lives that are like this, because these are your more often than not going to be your mission field. These are the people that you're going to be praying for, and pushing forward towards the faith, and trying to you're inviting them to church, and you're working and you're talking with them and having conversations where you can, and trying to breathe life into them, and through God's Holy Spirit. And so these people you don't necessarily want to be spending exorbitant amount of time with, but we do need to have these people in our lives, because it not only is it an opportunity for presenting the faith to them, but it's also an opportunity for you to sharpen yourself and be able to learn to defend your faith, and to be able to um, understand your faith better by contrast. So our last category, and for lack of a better word, I'm gonna use the word are evil people, because there are people in this world who just want to see it burn and want to lead people away from Christ, and they make it their goal in life to be detrimental to other people's faith. And I don't think it takes a lot of explanation to understand why we don't want to spend really any time with people like this, because at the end of the day they're going to they're going to be resistant to anything you have to say, and they're specifically actively trying to destroy your life. And so if you come across people like that, you try to witness to them and to breathe life into them. But these are not people that you're going to probably prioritize too much in when you're kind of thinking about the boundaries that you want to set with in different relationships. And so, looking at those first two categories, wise Christians and foolish Christians, for lack of a better word, there's going to be very limited amount of boundaries you set with these people. You're going to have a couple of really close friends that are they're gonna know a lot more about your life, and hopefully some of those are fall into the kind of the wise category, but these are people that you're generally walking through life with, and when it comes to the quote unquote "wise Christians," you're pursuing them and actively trying to get time in their calendar, because a lot of times they're gonna be fairly busy people. And so beyond that, then once you get past those first 2 categories, you're not just non-Christians that aren't necessarily actively trying to destroy people's lives are people that you want to think about how you're interacting with them and how much time you devote to them, because when you invest in them emotionally and whatnot, that can cause a detriment in your life. And so these are going to be people that are you have a ministry with, but they're not necessarily people that you're gonna share life with. And being mindful of how much time you spend with them, and not that you don't spend time with them, because they're lost and they need to have that light in their life. But I'm not gonna sit there and go out to dinner with them every other week or all the time. Like, you're going to be cognizant of how much time you let them invest into your life, because they're not necessarily going to be building you up. And we need to be built up in the faith through our fellowship with other believers. And then we kind of already talked about it with the evil people. You're going to definitely scale back to almost nothing for people that you come across that would fall into that category. So when we're talking about dating and romantic relationships, um, being intentional about boundaries becomes very important. And so the biggest one that you have to worry about in this case obviously is sexual boundaries. And as a man in a marriage, your responsibility is to provide and protect your wife and your family, and to um, make sure that you're able to fulfill those roles for them. When you're dating, that's not your responsibility yet. But the dating process is a situation in which you more or less are proving to her that you're capable of doing these things. And so when we set when we're intentional about the boundaries that we set, about how where we're going to be together, are we ever going to, I mean, ever being alone together? Are we ever, what kind of physical relationship is there? Being intentional about those and talking about them up front does a couple things. One, it shows that um, it proves that you're able to have some level of self control, and that is a big first step in a relationship, is showing her that you're not at the will of your just every thought and urge, and showing that you have the discipline to not do some of those things goes a long ways. as you continue through your relationship, you are then proving, kind of more or less proving to her that you can handle planning and finances, that you can provide for her, that you can be responsible, and you're demonstrating through, when you're being intentional, that you can be the husband that she needs you to be down the road. Before marriage, some things that you can be intentional about is asking her about her spiritual life. Um, Talking about the finances of a wedding and what that looks like in the future. Being intentional about asking about what the future looks like. Talk For me, I was someone who I don't want to waste someone's didn't want to waste someone's time when I was dating them. So it might have come across as intense, but once you got to the point where I knew what I wanted, I was gonna talk about those things very quickly. Maybe not on the first date, but by the second or third date, I was asking questions about what they thought their future was like, whether that be with kids or marriage or where they thought they'd be in a couple years. Because I had enough respect for that other person that I didn't want to encumber them from finding the person that God had in their lives for them. And so being intentional about those conversations also proves to them that you are responsible and conscientious about her time. Um, and so when you're setting, you want to you want to set boundaries about, be very specific about what it is that you want to set boundaries about when it comes, specifically when it comes to um, the physical relationship. I'm not going to tell you you can't hold hands with her or anything like that, but there are definitely things that are going to be off limits. Um, and I mean, things like oral sex or like getting naked in front of each other. Those things shouldn't be on the table ever for but before marriage. Like there are things that, yeah, you can kiss her. Like that's fine. But like at the end of the day, you need to put yourself in a position where you're not going to, you draw a line and you do not cross it, and that allows for you not to end up falling into temptation. And so we want to be intentional in each of those in those situations when we're pursuing a woman and going into potentially into marriage. So take this last piece with a grain of salt. I don't claim to be an expert at this because Alicia and I are just getting to the point of having kids now. And so I just want to talk a little bit about one bit of framework around how we want to approach parenting. And this is, so take this with a grain of salt. But first and foremost, and Alicia and I know agree on this one, is that going into marriage, the Bible says that we leave and we cleave to our spouse. We leave our family behind and we cleave to our spouse. It doesn't say that we leave our family behind and cleave to our kids. It doesn't say anything to that degree. And so Alicia and I, when we're going into having kids, we're talking about what is life going to look. We're already having a conversation about what is life going to look like after our kids do eventually move on and move out of the house and move forward in life without us. What does our marriage look like? Because eventually that day is going to come, and we want to be planned such that we can go and do other, we can continue our relationship after that point. And so our priority first and foremost upon having kids is our marriage. Our marriage and relationship become comes first. And I think that in the end, raising kids to be Bible believing Christians and have their own faith starts with a marriage that they can look at and see what it is, that the way that Christ loved the church. And because marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. And so having a very firm and strong marriage and prioritizing that first and foremost, even before your kids. Obviously, your kids are going to get a lot of your time and attention, but that relationship has to be the foundation upon which you build your family. It can't be built upon the kids. And then when the kids leave, you're stuck there trying to figure out what it's like to be married again once the kids leave. And so that's first and foremost, I think, the starting place that Alicia and I are going to attempt to take. And then going forward, as far as raising girls or raising boys, I think there's something to be said for both parents having a different role regarding which sex the child is. So if you're raising, we're having two girls. If we're raising two girls, my job as a father is to show and be an example of what a husband should look to for a wife, or excuse me, what a woman should look for in a husband. And Alicia is an example to them of how do you treat your husband and how do you treat the men in your life. And if you flip it, then when you're raising a boy, Alicia becomes the example, showing the young boy, this is what you should be looking for in a wife. This is how you what you should expect in a wife. And the father then is to teach the boy, this is how you treat all women, and this is how you respect and you protect and you provide for the women in your life. And so I can't wait to be able to share more as the years go by about how Alicia and I are approaching some situations. But I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. At the end of the day, take this with a grain of salt. But I think it's a potentially a good foundation to start on. Um, but all that to say, being intentional in your relationships is so important because so much of life revolves around other people and revolves around how we interact with those people. Um, it's so important that we approach it from the way God would have us interact with people, which is to say, we are approaching people with grace and truth in all things, and to be loving and compassionate and be able to meet people where they are. Um, and being intentional in the people with the relationships that we have allows you to invest the time that you need to in the relationships that are the most important. So this week on the Anvil Dispatch, I want to highlight another article or a different article that I found. This one I found in the National Interest. I will put a link to this article in the show notes as well. Um, and before I even jump into anything, so this is titled "A Farewell to Europe," and it's talking a bit about the challenges that Europe is facing currently, and I'm going to dive into it, but I wanted to just start there, um, and then I'm gonna read a couple of excerpts like I did last time, and we're going to talk about this as we go forward. So I'm going to start here. This is where the beginning of the article starts. In military history, there are instances in which one side unleashes a completely new weapon or form of combat, leaving the adversary so entirely off guard that they are unable to muster any effective defense. The Eurasian rider nomads are an example. Their archers stun the Europeans with their ability to shoot accurately from the back of a galloping horse, an assault method never seen before. Their incredibly agile hit and run mounted troops fired off flurries of arrows while attacking at high speed, and then, in a maneuver called the Parthian shot, they continued to shoot backwards over their shoulders as they sped away. The longbow upended medieval combat and added by adding unparalleled lethal range. The Byzantine use of Greek fire introduced shock and awe into naval battles. The British use of tanks in the First World War brought mobility and firepower to static trench warfare. These are black swans of combat, forms of attack that you can't prepare for because you can't imagine them. Europe is presently under attack from just such an unexpected black swan form of warfare. Skipping just a little bit here. The initial error of the Europeans was to fall for the illusion in 2014 that the mass arriving persons were primarily migrants and refugees. It was the height of the Syrian crisis, and in combination of soft heartedness and pragmatism, the Europeans assumed the people streaming across the borders must be Syrians. Spinning the fantasy forward, they imagined these would mostly be nice middle class Syrian families with a preponderance of medical doctors among them. They would integrate easily, it would be a perfect fit. As soon transpired, they weren't mostly Syrian, and they weren't mostly families or middle class. The majority were uneducated, single, younger men from Pakistan, Afghanistan, as the floodgates opened from territories beyond. By 2024, there were 11 million refugees, excluding illegal immigrants from 147 countries. What this is going to be driving at, and we're going to talk more about this, but and I want to give just one little piece of historical context before I go any further. Um, is this is talking about the migration crisis in Europe of young Muslim men who are causing a variety of issues within European countries. And as it talked about, tactics change and war tactics evolve. And the history of Europe through we kinda talked about it actually very briefly in the last episode with Columbus. There were hundreds and hundreds of battles, of Muslims invading Europe in the Middle Ages, and all of this really jumps all the way back to, um, Genesis 16, which is in the Bible, and it is a conflict that has arisen over the course of 4,000 years, more or less. And I'm going to read Genesis 16 here because I think it's applicable. This is the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert, and it was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I am running from my Mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." And the angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers." This story is applicable because what's not stated in the text, and if you do some research on it, Isaac, Abram's son, which is born later in the story, is the father of Abram and Isaac become the father of the nation of Israel. And so, but Ishmael becomes the father of a lot of nations that we would know as the Arab nations to this day. And so eventually what becomes of this is a bit of a rivalry between two sons for the inheritance and the blessing that God gave Abraham. um, when God made his covenant with Abraham. And we see this play itself out through history in the battles that take place between Israel and the Arab nations. And so through the Middle Ages, there were, I mean, Islam didn't become a country until I think it was 700 some odd AD. And through the course of the last 1300 years, there are many Muslim nations now. And that is because there is such thing as a Muslim conquest. And as the centuries have gone by, they were repelled out of Europe. But as Europe moved into a more secular democratic society, um, tactics have changed for their quote unquote invasion, so to speak. And so I'm going to move on here. So there's two segments I'm going to read. One is a little bit of an um, example of what occurred probably about 30 years ago in the form of a refugee crisis and what has been occurring now. And so it says, consider the Bosnian refugees, for example. Like the current migrants and refugees, they too were Muslim, arriving abruptly in 1992, fleeing the incredibly bloody and brutal ethnic cleansing and massacres of the Balkan Wars. They too were traumatized, mostly from conservative rural areas. Modern Western city life was an adjustment. Their adamant plan was to return to the farms and homes they had left behind. Still, as the conflict continued, they began to put down roots, and ultimately, over 90% of them stayed and settled in their European countries of refuge, primarily Germany, Austria, Sweden, and Denmark. Their current unemployment rate is lower than that of the domestic population, including women. Now, contrast that with this segment, and you can see how with the Bosnian refugees, they assimilated into the culture they were. They still had some remnants of their former culture, but they were willing to live within the Western norms that were the countries they were settling in. Um, so here's the second one. The effort to conquer Western civilization was twice repulsed at the gates of Vienna, but now aggressors have realized that the prize can be won so much more easily, that entry and conquest can be so much simpler. Instead of frontally attacking your target's fortified walls, maneuver yourself inside and then leverage the vulnerabilities of your adversary to paralyze his defense. In this case, two vulnerabilities are key. First, the European mindset, a mixture of guilt and smugly prideful masochistic liberalism. Second, their modern lifestyle is not family conducive. The combination of many single parents and dual career couples, a belief in personal self fulfillment and in female equality, creates great practical difficulties for the rearing of one, let alone several children. Those are fine and excellent values, except that Western European modernity failed to develop in parallel some effective new ways to accommodate the human and societal basics of family and reproduction. Enter the Afghans, Pakistanis, Syrians, Iraqis, Chechens, Somalis, and others who have no such issues. They happily produce 3 to 6 children per non self fulfilled, non equal woman. And like the Israeli state, Western European governments too had in the past set up programs to reward multiple childbirth with multiple financial benefits. The policy was aimed at their own young couples, but money, especially in the modest amounts offered, was not the principal obstacle. So that didn't work. Now, though, it is creating a rentier class of foreign men living off the wombs of their women. There's a couple things here. One is the two big differences lie in assimilation and the quantities of the numbers of people. The first came with an open mind to Western values and were grateful for the assistance because they were actually fleeing a war. The second group is coming in much higher numbers, and in reality, they're not actually fleeing a very specific war. Now, some of them are, but the large majority of them, when you're talking about millions and millions of people, are not fleeing a specific war. And they're coming with the with not wanting to assimilate, not being open-minded to Western values, and they're because they're not really fleeing a crisis, they're not grateful for the help that they're getting, and therefore, they're not looking to assimilate into the Western culture. In the end, a nation ceases to be a nation when the people are not the same people, because a nation is more than just a landmass. It is a group of people that are have a similar history. They share a government. They share a culture. They share a language and beliefs, and those norms create what we call a nation. If all of a sudden the nation is being changed entirely, whereas where the Europeans don't replace their it have a replacement rate with births, and the immigrants coming in are well over and overpopulating, does it is it still the same nation? And that inherently is one of the challenges that Europe is facing. It goes on to say, if your country is suddenly populated by people from an entirely different background who don't speak your language, are the products of a completely different history and culture, have no common roots with you, express hate or contempt for you, are committed to an expansionist religion that believes in conversion, and have principles very different from yours on basic matters such as dress, food, drink, behavior, and status of women, if they are determined and able to enforce your compliance with their principles, then you have not been joined by immigrants. You have been invaded by an occupying force. And I'm gonna read one. The next section is more or less just an example of one of these situations in which the people coming into Europe are not actually assimilating. And it says, in November 2025, the Austrian Teachers Union sent out a desperate SOS. They were, the head of their union stated, confronted with a culture war in the classrooms. Increasing numbers of their pupils were not just doing poorly in language acquisition, they were actively refusing to learn German on principle. Cooperative immigrant students were being threatened, harassed, and mobbed. Austrian children were falling behind in classrooms where some could not understand the lessons, and in the case of boys, announced that they would not listen to female teachers. Immigrant fathers were visiting the schools to demand that Islamic content be taught instead of the official curriculum. There are two tactics being used. One is this overwhelming number of people that are coming into these European countries, and that is bogging down the civil systems that they have, which is asylum applications and proving that they give one example in the article of proving that you're actually who you are, because a lot of the people who come in, a lot of these immigrants that are coming in are claiming to be younger than they actually are. But from the administrative standpoint, they have to be the administration has to be able to prove who they are and what age they are. And so for instance, you'll have a man who comes in my size, full beard, and he'll claim he's 14, but it's he burned his papers before he got there, and now it's on the administration to show that he's not 14, otherwise they process him as though he's a minor. And all of these different issues are overwhelming the civil services of Europe and causing all kinds of burden on these systems. Um, So that is overwhelming their systems to be able to even handle the people coming in. But then there is another another tactic that's being used. Um, and I'm gonna give a caveat here because I'm gonna read a few sections that um, talk about a handful of things that are probably not for the youngest of ears. And I'm going to avoid the worst of it because there are some things that they talk about in this article that are challenging. And so you be warned if you have young ears listening to this, maybe have them leave the room for this part of it. But it goes on to say, we have not yet come to the second tactic in the undermining of European civilization. violent crime, and sexual terrorism. German police data measure something called the TVBZ. This counts how many individuals out of 100,000 in Germany were implicated in a violent crime, such as armed robberies, knifings, and assaults, in a particular year. In 2024, the number of German citizens was 163. In other words, out of 100,000 native Germans, 163 were implicated in a violent crime. Now we come to the refugees and immigrants. For Ukrainians, the number was 443. For Turks, 538. Are you ready? For Iraqis, it was 1,606. For Afghans, 1,722. For Syrians, 1,740. And for Moroccans, 1,885. The worst damage to European cultural values and life is posed by one aspect of these violent crimes: the astronomical rise in sexual violence. Imagine that you have just arrived in a new country where your legal status is uncertain, where you are not yet able to provide for your own needs and livelihood, and where you are reliant on the goodwill of the local authorities and the population. Do you now decide that what you are going to do is sexually attack the women of that country? No remotely reasonable, halfway sensible person would do this. That behavior is anomalous and requires an explanation. The liberals, of course, have lots of excuses for their unruly proteges. They are unconvincing and embarrassing. Even someone from a very different culture, unaccustomed to the etiquette of Western courtship, knows that leaping upon women in metro cars and attempting to rip their clothes off is not the right thing to do. At the same time, they probably shouldn't scream for help. There is only one plausible interpretation. This is a deliberate and systematic attack on the Western way of life. The attack has three tiers: sexual molestation, rape, and gang rape, and it has two tactical purposes. First, it serves as an object lesson to its own women: wear hijab, stay segregated, stay close to home, be submissive, and don't even think about aspiring to the equality and emancipation of these European women, or we will treat you the way we treat them. Secondly, it fundamentally alters European public space and public life with an especially severe impact on women. It goes on to give some stats of each of these three different tiers of um, sexual violence, and I'm going to avoid some of they're the worst ones here again. I'm going to highlight a couple of smaller stats, but um, it says a survey by the German police found that two-thirds of women were afraid to use public transport after dark and had begun avoiding evening travel. In other words, the migrants have already succeeded in imposing a de facto curfew and psychological hijab on their host country's female citizens. Skipping down a little bit, nearly 70% of the women in the Paris region reported having experienced sexual violence on public transportation at least once. Skipping down again. In Sweden, nearly two-thirds, 63% of those convicted of rape have a migrant background, i.e., are first or second generation immigrants. In France, data for Paris in 2023 showed that 77% of convicted perpetrators of rape were migrants. In Italy, according to 2022 ISTAT data, migrants accounted for a disproportionate 42.4% of all of those reported or arrested on charges of sexual violence, while representing just 8.9% of the population. Again, I'm avoiding some of the most shocking statistics and things that this article talks about. The unbelievable part of this is that the European liberal governments are so unbelievably committed and determined to tolerate this kind of behavior and show commitment to their non-racist behavior and their commitment to multiculturalism. And tolerance is not Christian virtue. We're called to love, which is not to tolerate any poor behavior. Those are two very, very different things. To love is to care for and to be compassionate, but also to speak truth and to have grace, but to speak truth over situations. And the reality of the situation in Europe currently is that Europe is being overrun by immigrants from all over the world, and it is in large part destroying the culture that Europe is. And the article goes on to list out a couple of different ways that they could potentially solve the problem and fix it. But I want to take a step back to here in the United States and say some of these things are already starting to happen here. There are places in, I think it's Dearborn, Michigan, and in Plano, Texas, and there's a variety of other places in the country where there are these groups of migrants that are specifically not assimilating. And we saw it here over the weekend with in Sydney. This wasn't in the United States, but there are these sections of the population that are being radicalized and then going out and perpetrating attacks. And when they're not assimilating, that causes problems. And as Christians, we have an obligation to care for strangers and refugees and people who are worse off than we are. That does not mean we turn a blind eye to the ulterior motives that are occurring. And it says in, I think it's in Deuteronomy 7. I'll find the reference and put it in the at the end of at the end of the video on the outro card. Um, but it talks about how when Israel would allow people to come into their country, if they were gonna stay, they needed to convert to Judaism, because having people that are committed to another religion were going to lead the Jews away from their faith in God, and we see that happen over and over and over again in the Old Testament, and so it's prudent that we, and we kinda talked about this in the relationship segment, is that we don't spend so much time with people who are specifically trying to detract from our faith in God. And on some level, that can mean a reform and challenge and pause in immigration and migration to our country. Um, and all this to say, that's not to say that all Muslims are evil or violent for that matter. It is a small portion of them that are very radicalized. I have friends, we have friends that are Muslims, and they're very sweet people. We have This is those are not the people that I'm talking about. But when you've got people that do get radicalized, it can cause safety problems, and that is not loving to our neighbor. And those are things that we can address as a country. Um, and I think in our country, we are starting to see a turn of the tide in people and their view of immigration and allowing just anyone to come into it. And it's changing, which is a good thing. And I hope it continues to go that direction, because otherwise, we're gonna be looking down the barrel of the same kinds of things that are happening in Europe today. So, Man Cave Movies is a segment that I wanna use to talk about movies and movie reviews. Some will be seasonal, and I've always appreciated movies and films, so I wanna take I wanna end our episode here on a little bit of a more lighthearted note, and try to put an end to the discussion of how Christmas movies are ranked and what constitutes a Christmas movie. And the truth of it seems really self-evident to me. Maybe I'm this is really controversial. I don't know, but there's kind of, in my mind, three categories of Christmas movies. You have Christmas classics, which are holiday gold. They're the pure, unadulterated heart of Christmas, and they're the Christmas movies that feel Christmassy and what end up being what we consider the classics. Then you've got, so I would call that Christmas classics. Then I would say there's Christmas misfires, which is they mean well, but Santa's not impressed. And they they don't feel Christmassy because they take place in California, or they're just flat out bad and don't really capture any of that essence. And then you have this third category, which I'll call Christmas adjacent. They're not really Christmas movies, but they fall lightly into the Christmas category because they happen at Christmas, even though they happen have nothing to do with Christmas. This is where we put Die Hard. I know I'm going to catch a lot of flack for this, but the reality of it is it's not a Christmas movie in the traditional sense. And this framework of three, where you have Christmas classics, Christmas misfires, and Christmas adjacent, to me feels like a very obvious, self-evident, and logical way to think about Christmas movies. And so, with that said, my favorite Christmas movies, I I have to hand it to Elf. I watch that movie every time, every year, and it cracks me up. I didn't actually watch Elf for the first time until probably 10 years after it came out for whatever reason. And it's so quotable, and it's just fun, and it's at Christmas, and it's Christmassy, but it's hilarious at the same time, and it makes me laugh every single year. Um, the other one that I have really come to really appreciate in the last couple years is the Christmas Chronicles. So it's put out by Netflix, and when I first watched it, I just couldn't believe that the story had never been really told. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm not gonna spoil anything. It's only been out a couple years. But for the other big thing that factors into a good Christmas movie, in my mind, is rewatchability, because Christmas is gonna come around every single year, and the movies that you watch have to be movies that can be watched again and again and again and again without getting old, because they're gonna come around at this time every year. And so that leads us to our question of the week. This week, the question is, what is your favorite Christmas movie and why? And is there anything that you would say makes for a good Christmas movie too? Any specific feature or thing that you think a good Christmas movie has to have? Put those in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching here today. Like, subscribe, please share this episode if you found this helpful or insightful at all. Um, Otherwise, God bless, and we'll see y'all next week.